It's been a while since I've talked about the TurboGrafx, and you know what? That's a problem. I think this is still one of gaming's most underrated libraries, and I'm really encouraged to see a lot of new interest in it. So perhaps now is the right time to take a look at what I think are the best games on the platform. So if you're new to the console, or just a little turbo curious, or maybe you're just in the mood for a refresher, this is the video for you. Now, you can't have a dignified conversation about the TurboGrafx without bringing up Bonk, so let's do this right. Bonk's adventure is what a lot of people associate the Turbo with, and that's exactly what NEC wanted. He was meant to be a mascot for the system, which probably made more sense in Japan. Bonk's adventure is a 2D platformer with colorful characters, catchy music, and increasingly challenging levels. Also a few unique abilities, like the turbo flipping in the air, giving him sort of a gliding ability, chewing his way up ledges, and of course bonking enemies into oblivion with his giant bald dome. You also have meat that makes Bonk go insane and gain the ability to slam the ground and freeze enemies. Can Mario or Sonic do that? No, they cannot. Bonk's death animation is also quite a sight to behold here. Bonk's eyes bug out and he foams at the mouth, which is so unnecessarily dark and kind of morbid. Overall, Bonk's adventure is a good time. It's a simple game. You should understand basically everything about it within about 5 minutes. The presentation is outstanding all around with super catchy music and a very silly but adorable art style. That's pretty difficult to not appreciate on some level. Most importantly, though, the gameplay is fun and still holds up pretty well today. It gets a little bit overwhelming towards the later levels, so you might find yourself dropping out around that point, but it's certainly worth the ride, at least up until then. Bonk's Revenge is largely more the same, and that's totally fine with me. Levels are a little bit more varied, and some of the subtle edginess has been toned down. For instance, the death animation here is a lot more normal, and you just get a little band-aid on a sleeping Bonk's head. No dramatic foaming at the mouth here. Bonk's turbo flipping has been toned down a little bit to make it a little easier to determine if you're going to land on your feet or not, and you can also do whatever this is. There's still no parallax scrolling in the background, but there are more layers in some of the levels, which is nice to see. So it's another great looking game. Bonk's Revenge definitely has better bonus levels too, and does a better job of motivating you to collect smiley faces by rewarding you with more stuff at the end of the levels if you get enough of them. So in that way, it's probably a superior game to Bonk's Adventure, but both are great. It's the 90s, and there's time for clacks, which kind of seem like completely unrelated points, but we'll just put them together, that's fine. Clacks doesn't get talked about very much at all, so I'm gonna do my part and bring it up to you normies who haven't played it yet. It's a ridiculously addicting, intense puzzle game that functionally might remind you of Columns or Tetris a little bit, but it's actually quite a bit different from them. Yes, you are lining up colored tiles and making them disappear, like those games, but the rules are always changing on you. Sometimes you need to get vertical claxes, sometimes horizontal, and sometimes diagonal, and sometimes you need to just reach a certain score, or get rid of a certain amount of tiles in any way possible to beat the stage. It's always mixing things up and adding in more color types as it goes along. You can carry a handful of them at one time on this thing before putting them down, but I don't really recommend holding more than you absolutely need to. You can also throw tiles back up to the back of the line if you really don't know where to put it yet, but again, I highly discourage doing that, because if you do it more than a few times, you will be setting yourself up for an incredibly distressing situation very soon as they all come barreling back down towards you. Pretty sure this game is at least partly responsible for my anxiety as an adult. Also, when you do inevitably lose a tile by not picking it up in time, they scream as they fall to their death, I guess. I bet you didn't realize they were alive, did you? Well, they are, apparently. Just another unnecessarily morbid thing in a TurboGrafx game to make you vaguely uncomfortable. The diagonal levels are the ones that trip me up the most, because you really have to think ahead and stay organized, which are two things I'm particularly bad at. Not much in the way of music and clacks, but there are a lot of great sound effects and some pretty decent voices for the time. Overall, Clax is a really fun, really addictive, if not a bit overly stressful and maybe somewhat morbid puzzle game that I think goes really well with some beers and a couple of friends passing the controller around. There's also some pretty decent versions of this on the Sega Genesis and the Atari Lynx, so you don't have to have a turbo to play it, but come on, that's the way you should play it. Speaking of stressful and morbid turbo games, Splatterhouse is widely considered to be one of the crown jewels of the library, and it shouldn't take you more than about 5 seconds of seeing it in action to know why. It's essentially a bunch of ideas and aesthetics from various horror movies of the 70s and 80s thrown into a blender and somehow converted into a side-scrolling beat-em-up. Our hero Rick is trying to save his girlfriend Jennifer from the various monstrosities that occupy the West Mansion. So it's basically the story of Mario or Zelda, but with more chainsaws and flying vomit and horrible sludge baby things. So get ready to do a lot of punching, kicking, bludgeoning, and some shooting, and also some of this. There's not a whole lot of gameplay variety in terms of power-ups or moves, which is something the sequels would improve upon, especially 3, but there are some alternate paths and a hidden hard mode that make subsequent playthroughs absolutely worth doing. Also, every room is pretty different, with different enemies and overall designs. There's a sewer level, some outside locations, a crazy hall of mirrors where you fight bizarro Ricks, a haunted church, a literal womb where you fight weird embryo fetus things, and some levels auto-scroll while some don't scroll at all. They just kind of trap you in one spot until everything is dead, or you are. And all of that more than makes up for the limited moveset, in my opinion. Any horror hound should definitely give this game a try if you haven't already, as there's clearly a lot of love for slasher movies and haunted house stuff crammed into it. Also, pro tip, when you get to the shotgun in this level, just hang on to it. Don't use it. Just low-kick everything and throw stones until you get the second shotgun. Then just juggle them both until you get to the boss, and then you can just blast him. This is literally the only way I've ever beat him. I'm honestly not sure if there's any other way. There probably is, but this is the only way I've ever done it. I wonder what's under that bag, though. Kinda looks like Bonk. Anyway, Splatterhouse is a class act. If you haven't played it yet, then you're seriously missing out. This is another one of the few games that you don't technically need a turbo to play, though. The Splatterhouse reboot on the PS3 and 360 have the original 3 games playable, although the turbo version is not here, it's the arcade version, which I think is fine, and it's also basically the same game in terms of layout. Would have liked to have both versions on there, but whatever, that's a conversation for another day. You can also play Splatterhouse on an FM Towns Marty if that's somehow more convenient for you than a PS3 or a TurboGrafx. The next 2 games are sorely missing from the TurboGrafx-16 Mini, which I think breaks some sort of divine law, but nevertheless, the Legendary Axe games are absolutely essential if you want to fully experience this library. A lot of people say the first one is the best game on the system, which I don't agree with, but I can understand it. It is awesome. The game has you playing as Gauguin as he fights his way to the evil place to rescue his childhood friend Flair. Not a romantic interest, it's his childhood friend, so calm down. Thankfully, he's got the Legendary Axe to help him out, which has a charge meter that makes it pretty different from a lot of other side-scrolling beat-em-up hack-and-slash games at the time. Kinda works like Valis 3. Actually, it's exactly like Valis 3. Actually, Valis 3 is exactly like Legendary Axe. This came first. Legendary Axe has a lot of platforming, great enemy variety, and some downright gorgeous graphics considering it was such an early release for the system. My only gripes are fairly mild ones, and basically are limited to the music not being quite as good as other top-tier turbo games, the bosses not being super interesting, and the jumping feeling a little bit weird. I'm not sure how to describe it, but it just feels a little odd compared to other platformers. You can get used to it though. Still an outstanding game overall, and while it's not my favorite, it is an essential game for the system. Legendary Axe 2, on the other hand, might actually be the best game on the system if I had to pick. It improves on everything from the original game, adds additional weapons, controls better, has absolutely top-notch music and graphics, and yeah, it's about as close to a perfect game as anything from this era can get, in my view. The only thing that really feels like it's missing is the charge meter from the first game that made combat so unique. and the fact that the characters and story have nothing to do with the original game. In fact, I'm not really sure why it's called Legendary Axe at all, when it seems totally divorced from the first game in almost every way, and even emphasizes the sword over the axe anyway. Other than being in the same genre and having a protagonist that looks like he just emerged from some sort of bachelorette party, it's got basically nothing to do with Legendary Axe. The important thing, though, is that it's an outstanding game by any reasonable measure. Platforming plays a bigger role here than it did in the original game, with a lot of sections and entire levels being more vertical than horizontal. Thankfully, the controls are a lot tighter and more responsive than the first game, making platforming one of the more fun things to do in it. Combat is also really strong and well balanced, with the short but powerful axe, the Morning Star with its long reach, and the more balanced sword, which you'll probably want to stick with 90% of the time. Each weapon can be upgraded multiple times, and you also have bombs that you can toss out to deal damage to everything on the screen. I recommend hoarding these throughout the whole game as much as possible and just unleashing hell on the final boss, but you do what feels right for you. You can also jump on most enemies' heads and deal damage Mario style, which is fairly unique for this genre. So all of that versatility and variety more than makes up for the loss of the power charge meter, I think. The levels are more complex as the game goes on, and the killer soundtrack has an exceptional tune for each one, fitting them all like a glove. The Turbo sound chip really flexes its muscle in this game from start to finish, making it easily one of the best OSTs from the 16-bit generation, in my opinion. And also as a fact. It's a fact. You can't debate it. Don't debate me. Shut up. The challenge, the music, the graphics, the level design, everything is borderline flawless. Definitely play this by any means necessary. The TurboGrafx had a knack for putting out shockingly good replications of other popular games of the era, so they could kind of have their own version of whatever it was. Neutopia is one of the better examples of that, as it's clearly a Zelda-style game that rather shamelessly borrows a lot of what made that game great, but of course gives it just enough of a twist to not feel like a complete knockoff, although it still kinda does. More importantly, Neutopia stands on its own as a pretty fun game. You go back and forth between overworld sections where you talk to characters, level up, get passwords and whatnot, and the dungeons, or the labyrinths, where you hunt down bosses, collect valuable items, and progress to the next section of the game. It's pretty fun, honestly, and of course has a lot of great music. It starts off maybe a little bit simple for my taste, but as you get more abilities and start fighting stronger enemies, it does turn into a pretty good time. Most would say this is not the best game on the system, and I concur, as it's definitely held back by a few things. Most notably, not being able to move or attack in diagonal directions, and it's certainly not as good as Zelda overall. Searching for the medallions and discovering secret areas leads to some great aha moments, and the overhead action gameplay isn't bad at all despite being limited to just 4 directions. I do recommend giving it a shot at least once, especially if you like these classic Zelda-style games. It is one of the better ones from that era for sure. Kind of like how Legendary Axe 2 completely knocks every element of that genre out of the park, Soldier Blade does the same thing with the vertically scrolling shooter. Levels are always throwing new and interesting enemies at you to keep from even getting remotely stale, and the 3 weapons, while not particularly inventive, are really well balanced and all feel useful at any time. They each also have their own special attack, which are not equal in strength, but they are all useful. Your health and weapon strength are linked, so if you upgrade your weapon, you also gain another hit point, and vice versa. And using your specials will also cause you to go down a level, so you may only want to use these in a real pinch. I also really like that you can manually change your ship's speed at any time. I much prefer that to needing to hunt down speed pickups, like a lot of other shooters of the time. Bosses and mid-bosses are the star of the show here, with all of them having multiple phases, and some of them even returning in future levels for revenge with new abilities. Each level's song is an absolute standout once again, making this soundtrack another one of the best on the system and again arguably of the generation. My only complaint would be that the levels blur together maybe a little bit, just in terms of their design, but even still, they're so cool looking with great parallax scrolling layers, and some of them having multiple phases that I rarely even notice that they feel somewhat interchangeable at times. Overall, Soldier Blade is a total knockout. Hudson Soft was really at the top of their game here. If you really enjoy 16-bit shooters, then you owe it to yourself to get a hold of this game by any means necessary. Good luck though, this is one of the more collectible games for the system and eBay isn't pulling any punches. Another stupidly expensive turbo game that is still worth every penny if you ask me is Zonk. Zonk is of course the much cooler and smarmier descendant of Bonk, and an obvious last-ditch effort by Turbo Technologies to make the TurboGrafx appeal to Western audiences a little bit more. By 1992, Zonk's arrival was too little too late for the Turbo, but that didn't stop it from being an absolutely phenomenal side-scrolling shooter. Tons of wacky weapons, gorgeous colorful levels with lots of great parallax scrolling, and some of the catchiest music on the system make this game really difficult to turn off. It's just one of those games where if you start it, you'll almost certainly spend the next hour or two playing it. It's very addictive and oddly stimulating to play with how it's just constantly throwing new, crazy, bright, colorful things at you. Compared to most shooters of the time, Zonk is a bit on the easy side, with only getting really difficult in the final stage, which does kind of feel like it comes out of nowhere, with a basically full level, another full level, a boss rush, and a final boss all within the same stage with no checkpoints, by the way. So if you make it all the way to the end and lose your last life, you gotta do the whole thing over. I think it's fair to say this is a flaw with the game. Zonk isn't alone, of course. You've got this merry band of weirdos to pick from at the beginning of each stage that you can summon by collecting a big smiley face. And upon collecting a second one, you fuse together with them, creating a completely batshit eldritch nightmare monster that you can dominate everything around you with for a while. Always fun doing that and seeing what the character you chose will turn Zonk into. I like this one the best, I think. Hudson Soft was definitely having some fun designing this one. Other than cramming like 30% of the game into the final stage, I think Zonk is pretty well balanced and paced out. Would have been nice to have gotten another level or two somewhere in there, but I always prefer a game like this to feel too short than too long. Zonk is not perfect, but it gets a strong recommendation from me. There does seem to be some division among TurboGrafx fans about JJ and Jeff. Some think it's a great game, and others not so much. But count me in as the former. JJ and Jeff is a more straight-up platformer than most games you'll find on the Turbo. You jump around, you bop enemies on the head, you avoid hazards, and all that kind of stuff. But you also get to kick things, and not just enemies. You literally kick everything. Lampposts, trash cans, signs, steps, and the air sometimes. Why kick the hell out of everything in the game, you ask? Well, for coins, of course, and food, and sometimes poop. You constantly need food as your health, or vitality, is constantly draining, which is a little bit annoying, but not as annoying as the sound the game assaults your ears with if you let it get too low. Yeah, better to keep that vitality high. Coins can also be spent in slot machines that you find every now and then. If you do well in these, you can end up with extra lives, more vitality, but more often than not, you end up with more coins to apparently keep you gambling until you wind up broke, cold, and alone, just like a real slot machine. The levels aren't as varied or creatively designed as a lot of other Turbo games, but I think they get the job done well enough. The bouncy soundtrack picks up the slack quite a bit with some really catchy songs, and the gameplay itself, I think, is pretty darn fun. The only complaint I have is that you have to find hidden keys to access the boss and beat the level. Which often you do stumble upon them pretty easily, but not always. And if you do miss it, you have to find the green spring that sends you back so you can try it again. I wouldn't mind the key thing as much if you could just freely go back and forth to different zones, like a Wonder Boy game or something, but that's not how this game works, so it's kind of annoying. Ultimately, given the quirky humor, the great music, and the airtight gameplay, JJ and Jeff can be a lot of fun. Just make sure you pick JJ, don't pick Jeff, he slides too much. And if you get really good at it, you can do stuff like this. Give me those points. I put Bloody Wolf right up there with Legendary Axe 2 and Soldier Blade in the absolute top tier of TurboGrafx games. If you've ever played Ikari Warriors or Mercs, then you know what to do here. Blast everything that moves, rescue hostages, and keep getting new weapons to dish out increasingly devastating torrents of death. Like a lot of the better Turbo games, Bloody Wolf does basically everything right, and even excels beyond that in several areas. The isometric military dude on a secret mission shooter genre has a lot of great games, like the ones I just mentioned, but I honestly think it's easily one of the best, if not the best of them, certainly from the 16-bit era anyway. Movement is nice and snappy, the different guns are all fun to use, particularly the flamethrower. Different grenade types mix things up nicely, and the boss battles are a healthy challenge without ever fully tipping into ridiculously difficult territory. It does walk right up to that line a few times in my opinion, but never quite crosses it. The music might be the best part though. These tunes are some of the best on the system, and by extension, some of the best chip tunes ever. Great low-end bass riffs, drum parts, mid-section support, and stereo separation throughout the entire soundtrack, which wasn't that common at the time. It does kind of blow its load a little bit early with maybe the best track on the first level, but the way they bring it back for the final boss is pure genius, and will definitely make your blood pressure go up a couple of notches. Regardless of which character you pick, your mission is to save the president from the enemy, and just when you've done that, your character gets captured, and then the second half of the game is about rescuing him with the character you didn't choose at the beginning. I distinctly remember this twist blowing my 7-year-old mind at the time. It's still fun to experience that moment when you realize you're only halfway through the game, and you now have to rescue your bro. The levels are all great and stand apart from each other pretty well. Some of them even have great set pieces, like riding on a raft down a river, then stealing motorcycles and completely decimating everyone around you with them until they run out of gas and inexplicably explode for no reason. Some bosses are more interesting than others, like Knife Killer just being kinda average, and the tank and helicopter battles really standing out in dramatic fashion, but still none of them fall flat. A good handful of different enemy types with different firing patterns do mix things up a little bit, although they're largely pushovers on their own. They only get really threatening when they're in large numbers in that second half of the game. Thankfully, you do have unlimited continues in this game, so as long as you keep trying, you can beat it. Data East delivered a real winner here, and I don't think any TurboGrafx library is complete without it. Again, I don't want to pick favorites, as my opinion on that would probably change tomorrow, but I would still say this is easily in the top 3 or 4. So there you have it. That's gonna be part 1. I actually didn't intend for this to be a 2-parter when I started out, but it quickly became apparent to me that there's just too many excellent games on this system to minimize it with only 10 or 11. So let me know what games you think are the best the system has to offer, and I'll make sure to have part 2 up sometime soon. But until then, thanks for watching.